All right, here we go. Oh, awesome. Um,
Welcome from Canada.
are you Yana or Jana?
Jana, yeah, hi,
Jana.
you too.
Jan.
Yeah, I loved the conversation, so glad to join.
Oh, I'm so glad you're here. Do you have any questions you want to start out with, or comments, or um, I'm not fishing for compliments, but do you want to share what you liked about the conversation?
Okay, yeah, I really just listened to the first 45 minutes of it, but sure enjoyed. I was um, really interested, Jason, in your thoughts on imagining or addressing a particular kind of reader or even asking for care. I thought that was it really had me thinking, oh, we have options, or can let people know if we're nervous or thinking it's a provocative argument we're making, just ways of inviting people in. So I wondered if you could share more about how, that relationship, or how you've played with that, I guess.
Yeah, like just sort of thinking about who the reader is,
Mm.
just kind of like having this idea, and I think that uh, I I would have had a very different idea a while ago. Like I sort of had a more sort of sophisticated stranger in mind, like and I still do, like I still have a kind of there's a sophisticated stranger, and I'm one of those people who, like, if I had the chance, um I would prevent everyone who knows me intimately from reading my work. Like I would just sort of like if you could create a force field and stop like all of like your nuclear family and extended aunts and uncles from like reading your work, like I would just like boop, turn that on. Because there's a kind of intimacy that happens in literature that I think is really different um, than in real life. And I think that that kind of intimate, I mean, this is what I often kind of make. Why is this being so, sorry, this, I keep turning yellow. Um, I think my internet's a little bit slow. But that one of the really wonderful things about fiction and poetry um, is that they give you a kind of access that would be unbearable in real life. They give you a kind of understanding and a kind of intimacy that and I think in our actual relationships we experience briefly. We experience kind of in moments, or but and often followed by a kind of awareness that it's not sustainable. Like the kind of things that happen at a wedding or a funeral, where people are just really open and kind of share these. Like you just can't do that every single day. It's too much and it's exhausting. And so in literature that kind of happens. And so that's what I'm sort of thinking about, is that kind of really intimate moment, but with a stranger. And so I certainly think about, that we have ethical obligations to the people that we write about and to our readers. And we have an ethical obligation, I think, to also kind of, and this is what I found really frustrating about, or one of the things that I found really, like, if you followed the Claudia Rankin, Tony Hoagland conversation, in which Claudia Rankin really just asked if he had considered readers who weren't white, and was just really kind of saying, like, have you thought about the fact that you're going to be read by people who aren't white, and what it might feel like for them to be reading your work? And his response was to really treat it as an accusation, and to kind of say, I can write whatever I want. How dare you tell me not to? And and if you read her letter, there is nowhere where she said, don't do that. There was nowhere where she said, this is something you shouldn't do. But there are places where she said, this, I think I had a different response um, because of who I am. And I'm really sad that that didn't sort of, although actually I was about to say that didn't go forward, but actually, Rachel, you were part of that when Claudia opened up her blog for people to really kind of consider kind of whiteness in the context of writing an audience. And I remember reading a lot of those accounts. I remember you specifically were kind of in that. So it's not true that it didn't, that conversation didn't go forward. It's just sort of sad that that conversation that Tony Hoagland couldn't see what that conversation was and take part in it in any other way than a kind of defensive refusal. So in terms of kind of thinking about readers and audience, yeah, I think it's weird because it's super capacious, and yet you sort of want to exclude the people who are often the closest. Does that answer? Is that sort of like getting it at the?
Oh yeah, well put. Yeah, interesting to connect to the ethical obligations to the reader as well. Yeah, thanks.
I also,
Jason, you and I have talked about this like from each angle, right? Like, at one point in the Commonplace conversation, you say, well, I was at NYU and, we were all like confessional, but, you were at Iowa, and so you were doing some other thing. But, and we've talked about this. I mean, in many ways, you, I feel like, are much more private in your life and in your work, and have a thicker line than I do between your life and your work. Whereas somebody, like I've gone to almost all of the writers in my life for permission, and is this okay, is this okay, can I say this, can I write this, and someone like Wayne, who we've both worked with, who we both really admire, Wayne Kostenbaum, like he's always said to me, write whatever you want. You have no ethical obligations, to the people that you're writing about. And so that's interesting to think about also. And I wonder if you have any sense where you fall along, Sharon Olds calls it, the spectrum of song and betrayal. Like, do you think that's personality driven? Do you think that's an intellectualized choice? Like, is that just kind of who you are and how you are, or is it a learned behavior?
it's there's an interesting learned component of it, which is, without getting too much into the weeds, I come from a place where knowledge about you can be used against you, and the less you reveal, the more powerful your position. And I know that sounds really, really weird. And of course, like, I was, so in one way, I was pushing back against that. And in one way, I always felt like I was really bad at it. Like, I didn't know, like I have relatives that if you ask them a question, they just won't answer.
Mm.
And I never felt like I could do that. Like, if someone asked me a question, like I can't, like there's something in me, like I can't just sort of ignore a question. Like, I have to answer. Although I've tried being like the just like, it's a very powerful position. Like, if you've ever done it, if anyone ever asks you a question and you literally just do not respond, like just look at the person, it's really weird, but it really is a power play. Like
a therapist saying, "Oh, funny you should ask," or "interesting that you'd like to know," or
yeah, but or like more like because a therapist you're paying. Like, a therapist, like, you've like, there's no reason to not answer it. I mean, unless you're like Britney Spears and you're being forced into it, and like, this
No,
person
but the therapist,
yeah.
the therapist doesn't answer. Like, if you your therapist,
yes,
well, are you married, or do you
yes,
have children, or are you vaccinated? They're like,
yes. So one piece is that I always felt like I was very exposed, and I was aware that other people were better at kind of protecting information than I was. But the other piece was that if I said things, and another piece was that, I mean, I did grow up at a time when the kind of specific charge against queer people in kind of public spaces was that they were blackmailable. That there's this kind of like very long-standing tradition of excluding queers from particular kinds of responsibilities, particularly governmental, because they are blackmailable. And so there's like a very kind of strong, and this also comes out of post-Stonewall thinking, right? That if you are exposed, then you cannot be blackmailed. That to put everything out there is actually the position of power, because that means no one can use it against you because it's already out. And so this was a very strong tension that I always felt kind of caught in between. And also like the post-Stonewall metaphor of the closet, that prior to Stonewall sort of coming out is actually kind of a metaphor for debutante balls, that coming out, and there are many different metaphors for queer life. So like there's like dropping hairpins, there's, you know, asking people if they go to gay parties. And then after Stonewall, it becomes like this really strong truth value. Like you are in the closet or you're out of the closet. And so I grew up inside of that metaphor. And so I had this really strong kind of truth value imposed upon me where, you know, like you can lie or you can tell the truth. And these are the only options that you have. And yet in my family, I'm also aware that, you know, like the more you can conceal, the more power you have, and the more that you're exposed, the less power you have. And then add to that, that usually when I told people how I actually felt, they thought I was joking because it was so sort of outside of what anyone thought that I was sort of like, I just made no sense to anyone. And so like so in terms of like how this all impacted my poetic practice was that I learned that I had to be oblique in order to make sense. That if I ever told anyone something as directly as like a Sharon Olds poem, I didn't make any sense. But also someone like Sharon Olds, and I've always meant to write this essay, people tend not to pay attention to her really oblique work. So if you look at a poem like The Pope's Penis, you know, like it sits, I forget exactly how it goes, but, you know, the Pope's penis sits like an unrung bell. You know, it's like, it's so funny. Like she has a huge amount of work that is oblique. You know, the lines, I mean, she predicts the internet, right? I mean, you know, everyone's standing under the sign that says wants to get fucked. That everyone's at the line that says, you know, wants to fuck senseless, wants to get fucked senseless. Which I mean, really predicts the way we live now. So I'm in a kind of, I've always felt kind of caught between a number of different restrictions in terms of how much could be revealed and how much could be withheld. And if I do reveal what I really think, people tend not to hear what I'm actually saying. And so the obliqueness of poetry and the kind of the sort of the sideways approach of parable became a way for me to actually be understood in a way that I couldn't find anywhere else. And so I am private. The other thing I found is that no one likes to be, some people do. And so when I say no one, this will be an overgeneralization, because I love being in your poems, Rachel. But the vast majority of people do not like being a side character in someone else's story. And so every poet who writes a story in which someone else is there, they're always the side character because we're all at the center of our own universes. And so people tend to feel a little bit used, a little bit misunderstood, a little bit angry, a little bit disconcerted. And I remember the first time this happened to me, I was an undergraduate, and I had one of my professors, at the time we were working really hard for domestic partnership benefits, so it was a long time ago. And so in this fight for domestic partner benefits, where I was the liaison between the faculty and the student queer groups, or we didn't say queer back then, we said LGB, I had a professor whose partner was dying of cancer. And because of the lack of extension of healthcare benefits, the partner had to maintain a job. And there was this whole thing where had she been married, had marriage been something she could access, then the healthcare would have been provided and their lives just would have been like a lot easier. Like it wouldn't have taken away the cancer, but it would have made all of the logistics around treating the cancer and around end of life issues just a lot easier. And I wrote a poem about it. and I showed it to her. And
We're one
I
of
was like
five.
19. And she said, that is a very, like, she didn't say I don't like the poem or I like the poem. She said, that is your experience. Like she was very clear that like that was not her, that was my version of her. And I thought that was a really powerful response, because in a certain way it freed me from a kind of nonfiction approach. Because in sort of saying, like, even if you're writing memoir, then even if you're doing something that factually represents me accurately, it's still what I mean to you, right? And so I've always had that kind of somewhere where in my mind. And also, like, I mean, I'm aware that I often lived inside of really difficult narratives about myself. And in fact, in Wayne's class, I tried to write a memoir, and it was only what other people, the entire memoir had no me in it.
Hmm.
It was all how I understood other people to have seen me.
Okay, wait, can I ask you a question about
Yeah.
that, Jason? I want to make sure to also ask V, because they're writing stuff down and I'm like so curious to know, because I'm so intrusive,
Mhm.
unlike you. Um, but can you try to connect two things for me if they're connectable? One is um, writing obliquely to be understood, um, and being understandable in your work, or being seen, or being, somehow having that connection through the writing of poetry, but not wanting that connection with people who are in the poems, or with your family, or with people who are sort of personally close to you. So I'm wondering about, like, is there a very different relationship that you have? Or do you not want to be understood by your family and by your, like, these close people? Is it a very different, like, do those
Well,
two things go together?
yeah, and this has changed because poetry has become popular. That when poetry was not popular and before the internet, um, poetry felt like something where the only people who would find it were also people who understood the rules. And so when you were dealing with, Ashbery, or something, like, or Lynn Haginian, where the kind of thing, there's a story about, I think it's Teresa de Lauretis. She's a theorist, and her family would play a game. And this was the height of literary theory. This was in the 1980s, when, like, the height of deconstruction. And her family would play a game where they would open her book of critical theory and just, like, kind of like just open it to a random page, point at a sentence, read it out loud, and then laugh because it made no sense. Hegemony, deconstruction, a subaltern, like it was because it was just like the string of jargon to them. And poetry, it and I'm really defensive of, like there's a part of me that thinks it's kind of, it's like it's not for them, right? That like when what they're actually indexing when they open that book and they play that game is that it's not for them. And so their only response is ridicule. But it's also, and so for me, like, poetry, I I started turning to poetry um in part because I needed something where um I couldn't be judged by that kind of immediate family structure. Like, I needed a space where I couldn't have that kind of intense um judgment. And so the obliqueness, like, there's a I never meant to be funny. And I know I can have a reputation as being funny, and I like that. Um, but the first poem that I wrote that was funny, that was consistently funny, was, it's my first book. It's called Charlie Brown at the Bottom of a Well. And I, as a child, hated Peanuts. I thought that Peanuts was adults laughing at children. And I thought that it was like adults kind of sentimentalizing the abject pain of being a child. And and I hated people laughing at Charlie Brown. And so I thought if I wrote a poem where I did something so horrible to Charlie Brown that, you know, no one could laugh anymore. Like, you'd have to see like how truly terrible this is. It turned out to be hysterically funny. And every time I read it, like, everyone just laughed. And I realized like I realized that I'd gone over the top. I realized that it's sort of in my effort to kind of, to push something and make it visible, I'd actually kind of pushed too far and gotten to this other place where it was funny. But I also realized that was a kind of welcome, that also kind of brought people in. And once I found out that Kafka's work had been considered hysterically funny in his lifetime, and that Kafka was this sort of writer where if you discuss it in a group, it's very, very funny. If you read it at home, it's very, very sad and dark. I realized that that was kind of what I wanted to do. And so it was and it was a way of finding a form of vulnerability that was safe. It was a way of finding that kind of being oblique and going in through parable, it meant that I didn't have to risk certain kinds of anger or humiliation or exposure, but I could also get at what I wanted to say. And I also learned how to make peace with misreading. And I learned how to make peace with the idea that if I was structuring an experience and people substituted a different content, that they thought I was talking about the Holocaust when I was talking about being adopted, that they thought I was talking about, you know, whatever it was talking about something else, that could be a way to kind of bring people in. And maybe I wasn't that worried about whether or not they understood kind of the content, because that also felt like that would slip away, right? Like that would be like a kind of historical, that would be like kind of a moment in time. But if I could make a kind of larger humanist argument through a parable, that would have a kind of lasting impact. And so yeah, it was a very weird confluence of self-protection, of wanting to be understood but not being able to make myself understood, of finding that being direct often got me to the wrong place. That if I just told someone what I was thinking, I didn't get at what I was trying to get at. But if I went around another way, then people actually kind of got to what I was saying, but not necessarily based on the content, but based on kind of like some larger sort of emotional truth or principle. And so that's kind of my history of oblique privacy that always feels, you know, in the portrait of Dorian Gray, where Basil feels extremely exposed by the portrait, and he's like, "Oh my God, everyone who looks at this portrait will know me intimately," and of course it's stupid. Like it's kind of an object of fun, and you're like, it's just a painting of a guy. Like no one's gonna see any, like, and obviously, like, you know, they're gonna see that he's gay. They're gonna see by the way he painted Dorian that he wants to have sex with Dorian, and this is why he kind of has to like get the painting back. But I often kind of have that, like, I don't think it's silly anymore. Like, I do have this feeling like, oh my God, I'm gonna get found out. Like, oh my God, like, but also the thing about, one of the things that I really value about art, and one of the things that kind of differentiates art for me from other kinds of, like, from newspaper articles, from journalism, from, you know, or what lets something like journalism rise to the level of art, is that if you keep going back to it, it keeps yielding. That every time you go back, you kind of get some new layer. And so that was what I wanted to do in my own work, And I found that kind of like building up those sort of stories, the kind of approaching things obliquely became the way that I could actually have the emotional impact and kind of get at the truths that I wanted to, while feeling a kind of comfortable level of exposure.
After all of this hard work, Jason, how much can you lift with your obliques? Thank you for that good joke. Um, V or Amanda, if you had any questions or comments for Jason, I have, of course, have another question about the metaphor of the closet, but I'm gonna resist talking constantly. Anyone else would like to ask Jason or talk to Jason about something?
I have a question. It's sort of open-ended, Jason, but one of the parts of the conversation that was so interesting and engaging and exciting for me was when you were like, this is the end of modernism. And I think both Rachel and I went, huh? And like wanted to hear more. But
Sure.
I think I'm thinking about that in terms of like how modernism has also sort of historically coincided with the emergence of like queer culture as a, I mean, arguably, like with Foucault, the emergence of queerness as a social structure, but specifically with queer culture. And if modernism is ending, I guess I'm sort of coming back to Rachel's question of what is next. But I wonder if you could talk more about that sort of connection between modernism and queerness, and how what is happening now with, for example, moving away from sort of binary identities and more toward like communal belonging and different ways of expressing that, how that is expressed in terms of culture and what that means. Very
Yes.
open-ended, but
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and I feel like I haven't done like what I'll say now. I'm not sure that I have the scholarly chops to like get this through a peer review, but the emergence of what we call modern subjectivity, and like particularly early modern subjectivity in Europe with the return of the Greek and Roman texts from the from what had been Byzantium, as Byzantium is falling to the Ottoman Empire, coincides with colonialism. And there are a number of arguments that the kind of ways in which we think about gender as very strictly binary, and the ways in which we think about sexuality as very much kind of male and female, and certainly they're not the same. Like if you're looking at an early modern perspective on gender, the Elizabethans more or less thought of women as men without penises, and it's often a very different kind of it's a very different kind of structure of gender. It's not opposite. That like the whole like notion of opposite gender actually kind of emerges in the Victorian period, and I don't know if it's better or worse, but like, you know, so the early modern British version is kind of women as lesser men, but also with the belief that under particular circumstances, biological anatomical gender could change, that under the right circumstances, a woman could produce a penis, or under the right circumstances, a man could, his penis could actually boop, like go back in and become a vagina. And most of this, you know, I know from Shakespeare studies, as people are kind of talking about, particularly Twelfth Night. And so, but there's an argument that particularly in response to the sort of what we would now call queer formations within the Americas, and what we now call Two Spirits, and that term is only as old as the 1990s, but is an identity that's that's incredibly ancient, that European subjectivity kind of enforced a kind of heterosexual assumption and a kind of gender binary as a way of distinguishing themselves as virtuous and Christian against what was happening in the colonized Americas. And so the emergence of the kinds of identities that we think of as gay, and I often talk about this like in my queer cinema class, like when we use like LGBT, IAQ, none of those terms is older than 1860, right? The sexologists who are putting together this kind of idea of the homophile or the Urning or the Uranian in the 1860s, you know, they're kind of coming back around to an identity, and there's kind of a sense that they're starting from scratch, but they're also not. And so if you're looking at like Edward Carpenter, a really foundational work of 1920s sexology is Edward Carpenter's, I'm going to get the name wrong, but it's something like intermediate types among, and then he uses some term like, he doesn't use the term indigenous, but what we would now call indigenous peoples. And so he actually in the 1920s is doing this sort of anthropological approach and being like, look, hey, actually, like in other societies, there are all these other things. And then of course, like, you know, and this becomes kind of a tradition of like, you sort of get like a lot of academic work that's looking at non-binary understandings of gender, things that might be read as queer, things that might be read as gay, things that might be read as lesbian. And then this kind of leads into inversion. And then inversion is miserable. Like no one likes inversion. Inverts hate inversion. And so in terms of, so, and then that kind of gets us to the homophile movement, which gets us to Stonewall, which gets us to now. But this kind of return, you know, when I took my queer theory course, the transgender professor put a lot of pressure on a line in Eve Sedgwick's epistemology of the closet, and a lot of the early, like particularly Sedgwick and Butler, are feminists who are coming out of feminism, and when they reject the kind of structuralism and essentialism of what we now generally call second wave feminism and sort of what unreconstructed became a kind of TERF or gender critical approach. And they began to introduce deconstructive ideas and kind of what we broadly call French theory, which is kind of silly because the French theorists all hate each other. Like Foucault and Derrida spent their entire life like talking about how stupid the other one was and how wrong they were. But if you're an American, you're like Foucault and Derrida, they go together. Sorry, I know this is a really long answer. So, but he put a lot of pressure on a line in Sedgwick where she says, I'm going to turn away from the coarser lens of gender towards and I forget the word, but it's like the richer lens of sexuality. And the idea being that sexuality is, you know, this really multiplicitous kind of thing. And then she lists, you know, all these things about sexuality. And I'm still very, very dedicated to Sedgwick, and I would still consider myself Sedgwickian. But that kind of offhanded comment where she kind of treats gender as just, you know, male or female, yeah, you know, it's coarse, we're done, like it's boring. I think that that's really been rejected by, you know, at this point, I would say 2, possibly 3 generations of trans scholars, particularly notably starting with Jay Prosser. And so modernism, right, like kind of is being inaugurated at a moment that it's erasing all of the indigenous versions of non-binary and what we would now call kind of queer identities, which then kind of keep getting rediscovered and then keep kind of getting renamed and brought back in. And many, many years ago, I gave one of my first academic presentations was on slam poetry, and it was about modernism. And I talked about the modern, the postmodern, and the anti-modern. And kind of part of my argument was that slam, in many ways, was outside of conversation with the sort of like, you know, are we language poets? Are we, you know, this kind of poet? Are we that kind? Are we confessionals? Are we avant-garde? Are we rear guard? Are we formalist? That slam was very much kind of just not interested in those conversations. That slam was kind of, and I couldn't think of a term to call it except for anti-modern, because it just wasn't engaged in the conversation. It was just like, I have something that I need to tell you, and I arrange some words in a way that you'll be able to hear it. And if I say it that way, it kind of sounds like I'm making slam sound like it's uneducated, which is not. But my larger point was that it was refusing a tradition. It was putting together a series of rules and aesthetics that were not independent of kind of what was going on in the academy, but was also saying like, but that's not what we're doing. Like, that's not what we're interested in. And so being at the end of modernism, like I think that the dominance of slam and the fact that slam has kind of melded with poetry in a way that those kinds of conversations that you had 20 years ago just don't, they're incoherent. You know, like I remember Kristen O'Keefe-Aptowitz at AWP asking, you know, like, will this journal publish slam poetry? And when the editors would say, well, we publish good poetry. We publish the poetry that we appreciate, you know, and it's like, then no, right? Like because you're not listening to what I'm saying, because I'm coming from this other tradition and you're sort of refusing to acknowledge the tradition that you're inside of. And so I think in some ways like that, the way in which a figure like Amanda Gorman, or the work of Danez Smith, or people who've come out of a tradition that was less interested in sort of exactly the kind of historical trajectories I described here, but more interested in a kind of what work is this poem doing in the world, and is it, you know, kind of affecting a kind of political change that I would have, you know, like 20 years ago would have been like, poetry doesn't change things. What are you talking about? Poetry expresses things, and I still kind of have like an investment in literature, not as an intervention into culture, but as an archive of culture. And of course, Oscar Wilde says that it's an intervention, right? I mean, Oscar Wilde is the guy who says actually art is an intervention into culture and that life imitates art. So the art you put into the world is what people are going to act out. But you always think, you know, Oscar, that's always the opposite of whatever he's saying. But that's kind of what I was talking about with being at the end of modernism, the kind of what I think I'm seeing now in terms of how popular poetry has become, what people think about poetry, and particularly in the way that I wrote that long essay about the sonnet, that the sonnet is seen as the emergence of early modern subjectivity because the sonnet is structured around the divided self. And it's the change from a medieval subjectivity in which there's a unified self, and then the Renaissance or the early modern subjectivity is a divided self, which we still live inside of. But I think it's something different. And those divisions are not the same. It's not the same. And so with this kind of end of modernism, I don't know, I have no predictions about what it looks like other than that I can kind of mark a few spots that kind of tell me that it's changing. But I also think that, you know, the right now there's a huge interest in there's queer people and sort of LGB people or homophile people or inverts or earnings have always had this kind of craving for history that I've never quite understood. And I've written about this, that in both Faggots by Larry Kramer and Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg, there are these long passages where they're so angry that they've been cut off from queer history. They're so angry that there are all these people who they can identify as having led what we would now call queer lives. They did that somehow. And my reaction was always, but if you know, like, Like, if you know about Verlaine and Rimbaud, it's a terrible story. They were caught at customs, and Rimbaud was forced to sit on a pile of flour to leave behind an impression of his asshole so that the customs inspectors could determine whether or not his asshole had been penetrated. I cannot, like, I'm like, I don't like this story. Like, you know, if you're like, oh, don't worry, Jason, you have forefathers, Paul Verlaine. You know, I'm like, maybe I won't say anything. But I do think that like these, like now I sort of get it a little bit more, that if you can kind of trace these trajectories, they leave you more space. And some of them are also quite specific. Like when I was an undergraduate and everyone, you know, the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, the Foucault, you know, I could never understand what was groundbreaking about it. Like everyone was always like, oh, it's such a great, like, it was so important in the 70s. And like, you know, and I was like, how? Like he discovered a record of how starting in 1700, people started getting arrested for sodomy in France. Like like, this makes everyone feel better. But what he did that I now understand is that a generation of people who had been raised on a very specific version of criminalized and pathologized homosexuality, who had been told by a particular kind of psychology and a particular kind of criminal justice that they were bad and wrong in a specific way, had found an alternative history in which they were bad and wrong in a different way. And if you're bad and wrong in a different way, then you might know more about yourself than the person who's telling you that you're bad and wrong in this way. And so in 1976, like now I'm like, okay, now I get it, right? Like, okay, yes, that sounds super liberating. But as, you know, like a young gay person in 1994, I was like, like, this doesn't seem better. This seems really awful.
Have you heard, I can't remember where I read this, but I read an essay once in college that was about essentially Foucault writing the history of sexuality to erase gayness so that he could inhabit a world where he wasn't gay, he was just a person experiencing bodies and pleasures. It was, I don't know if that, but anyway, that is something that you just made me think of. But I think Rachel just asked what inversion is. So.
Oh, I want to get back to this. You'll also notice I'm much more comfortable talking about intellectual things than I am talking about myself. But as soon as I could, I was like, I don't want to have to talk about me. But inversion is a dominant mode of understanding what we would now call LGBT identity, that was dominant from about like the late 1890s to like the 1950s or so. And the idea is that female inverts are male souls trapped in female bodies, and that male inverts are female souls trapped in male bodies. And they often have a kind of like a female invert will be quite masculine and a male invert will be quite feminine. And it's not like gayness, because inverts can only be attracted to heterosexuals. Inverts can't be attracted to each other. And so like Genet solves this problem through rough trade, right? As long as he's paying for it, then he has a partner he can be attracted to. If a male were ever to say to Genet, like, I like this is fun, let's do more of it. Now you're an invert too, and this is not hot for me because I'm only attracted to men. In The Well of Loneliness, the way that this is dramatized is that Stephen Gordon, the main character, has a relationship with a woman, Mary, but the idea is that Mary is only attracted to the male in Stephen. And so it's really, I teach the last check. You only need to read, it's a terrible book. She talks to her horse talks back. It's very classist. It's very Christian. It's very like, it's not a good book, but the happy ending is that Mary gets seduced by Stephen's male friend who's a Canadian, so he can take Mary to Canada and no one will know that she's had this licentious past in which Mary was involved with an invert, and Mary can have babies because Mary's not an invert. She needs to have babies. If her womb isn't full and she's not a mother, she can't have a fulfilled life. And Stephen heroically sends Mary off with this friend, and then it's, you know, like, and the ending is be nice to inverts because they're really, really unhappy. Like their existence is miserable. They can only love people who can't love them back, and the people who do love them back don't really love them back and would be much happier with someone who's not an invert. And this is why gay liberation and the homophile movement were so focused on the equality of male and female bonding. And that's why kind of like the gay and lesbian figures that emerge from the homophile and the gay liberation movement are so focused on, we are both men who love manlily, like, you know, the sort of the Tom of Finland kind of stuff. It's very much a reaction. But, and like Jay Prosser makes the argument that inversion is actually a form of transgender experience. And he argues that The Well of Loneliness should be read as a transgender novel. And I actually really strongly disagree, because I really think that if you try to read The Well of Loneliness as a trans novel or a lesbian novel, it's a bad novel. Like if you're trying to make it a lesbian novel or a trans novel, apparently Stephen just doesn't know how to be either. Stupid Stephen. But if you read it as an invert novel, then you, and this is again like my thing where like I treat literature as an archive rather than an intervention. And so even though The Well of Loneliness is very clearly intended as an intervention, I read it, you know, sort of for the archive of what these identities are. And but it also in the homophiles taking over from the inverts, the trans erasure is horrifying. And so, and you know, inversion is kind of a mashup of trans and LGB identity, and you know, it shouldn't be forgotten that it really there was a huge trans erasure in the movement from a kind of inversion liberation movement to homophile and then gay liberation. I'm sorry. I feel like there's a question I was supposed to be answering, and I completely like I was like, wait, was I supposed to say that?
That was totally fascinating. I'm like trying to get my mind around. I mean, there are times where this is such a dumb thing to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. The way that people have made sense of human experience sometimes seems to me to be like some kind of game of Twister, where it's like, wait, this made much more sense before you tried to make it make sense intellectually. Like emotionally, this makes sense to me, but now intellectually, I'm like, wait, what? That's the soul of what? So I had a perplexed look because I was like, this is fascinating how far people will go to make sense of, you know.
Yeah. And to live inside the available identities that they think they have access to, and how hard it is to structure something so that it actually fits what you need. And I mean, the closet, like I mean, I said earlier, the closet, like I think of the closet as a concept metaphor, that it actually creates the meaning that it's pretending to describe. And my proof of that is that it's one, it starts in 1969. Like, you know, people don't talk about closets before that. And two, there are other metaphors for it prior to Stonewall, that in the earlier decades, you know, there are a lot of ways of communicating gayness, but they all include multiple versions of the self that
So
you can drop.
That was actually my question, which is both intellectual and personal. So I hope it's going to be okay. But do you have a metaphor for your own queerness that feels comfortable for you or apt for you, or that you like, either one that's, you know, that you've made up, or, you know, because I'm really fascinated by what you're saying about the closet, um, both as a concept metaphor, which is not a phrase I'd ever heard before. So thank you. But also as this kind of all or nothing, again, binary of you're either totally honest about every single thing, or you're totally in the closet. And that, again, that's like, doesn't seem to fit anybody's experience that I know.
I mean, I think in a lot of ways, I was protected by how completely I conformed both internally and externally to gay stereotypes of the like 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so everyone assumed, I can count on my hand the number of times people have thought I'm straight. Like I can count on my hand. And like the times it's happened, I've been very confused. I feel like, oh, wait. You know, and sometimes, like, you know, like I had one many years ago. I had a student who just sort of had chosen me to confide in, which I take very seriously. Like if a student confides in me, then that is something that I will always take very seriously. But he was confiding in me about girl troubles in a way that I realized assumed that I shared the experience. and I wasn't going to come out because I this is about him. This is his, you know, if that's what he needs to project onto me at this moment, great. And, you know, we can disrupt that later. But if this is kind of like what he needs, but I mean, it was such a weird, I was like, really? But I think because I sort of fit all of those sort of subject positions, because I have the voice, I have the mannerisms, I like drag, I want to watch Betty Davis movies. And there are funny stories. I mean, I don't want to. It was traumatic when I was really young. I mean, there's a whole long story about how when I was 14, I was very relieved that I wasn't gay, because gay men like Judy Garland, and I like Liza Minnelli. I actually don't like Judy Garland. I'm a Liza Minnelli fan, and you know who else I like? George Michael. I think that's a very good masculine role model for me. You know, like, I mean, so I don't want to suggest that there wasn't like a long period of delusion and difficulty with this.
I'm laughing really hard. I'm sorry.
but no, but I, in a lot of ways, like in the same way that delusion was protective, that delusion kind of kept me from having to sort of believe that I had to tell people things before I was ready. By having sort of fit all of those positions so clearly, and sort of so neatly, I think it made it easier for me to see what other people were going through. And it made it easier for me. So when I had the revelation in my class that the closet is a concept matter. And I was very aware, I mean, by the time I was a freshman in college, I was aware that sex and gender had been differently organized in different times and places. And I wanted to talk about it a lot, and no one else did. That every time I tried to have that conversation, love is love, right? Like, and we didn't say it like that. I mean, no one said that until 2010. But it was this kind of like, gay people just are. And it was like, well, I mean, I know we are. I mean, clearly. But can we talk about how it's organized? Like, can we talk about what it means? Can we talk about how it means something here that it doesn't mean there? And a lot of people never kind of understood what I was saying. And when I said the thing about the closet being a concept metaphor, I had someone who was about 5 years older than I am, like, flip the fuck out on me. And he was like, how dare you say the closet's not real? Like, I was in the closet for 20 years. And I was like, well, I'm not saying that you weren't. Like I know, I believe you. And I believe that it was very painful, but I'm also saying that this was a particular structure that you experienced, because that's how we built things. Like just because something's a concept metaphor, just because this is the way that we understand it, doesn't mean that like we can just slip outside of it. Like, just like, that's like the first step. Like, recognizing that something is structured doesn't mean that the structure goes away. Of course you still live in it. But in terms of kind of being able to recognize what other people were experiencing, that it was different. Like when I first started I'm trying to remember because when I was in college, and things changed so fast. Like between 1994 when I started in 1998, like in 1994, the LGBA had two meetings. One was a support group that was an incredibly secret support group in which, you know, like we had a cover story in case like we recognized each other outside of the student union. You know, where people really kind of struggled with what was going on, and things were not, you know, we weren't protected. And by the time I graduated, you know, it was like that particular meeting had become like a 30-person discussion group in which people just said like the dumbest fucking things, and I couldn't even go because I was like, I cannot, like I'm really glad that we're not in the place where we like, you know, need to get together and like cry and hug every Monday, but like I don't want to be part of like the worst, like, yeah. Things changed so fast, but there was, it began to be really clear that the institution had no way of supporting us. And I became aware of trans issues because we had trans people who were in the group, and we didn't, I mean, as students, we didn't, or as a gay student, I didn't know what to do. Like, I didn't know how to be supportive. I didn't understand like the structure of identity. And it was really clear that the institution didn't understand. And so, you know, when I was trying to talk about that, and my proud moment is that I ended up on the ad hoc committee for diversity, reporting to the search for the new president. And it was like, when you have a minoritized subject position, your intuition is usually a better gauge of when you're in somewhere tokenizing and when you're in somewhere productive. And this was it was like a Benetton ad, you know, where we're all sort of supposed to be representing our differences. And, you know, so there's, and then they had us on this panel where we were, and it sounds ridiculous. We were on a very low table, and then they were at a high table. Like it was really out of Kafka. Like the actual search committee was on this like elevated dais with like their chairs by the table, and then we're like, you know, literally like 8 feet below, looking up, and our demand over and over again as students, the demand for vesting partnership benefits have been a different kind of demand, but the demand over and over again as students was like, we can't do this, like we need institutional support, like we can't do this, like we can't. And in saying that, you know, and I said like, you know, we have absolutely no structure to support transgender students. And then I said, and based on the looks on your faces, none of you even know what the word transgender means. And everyone kind of like sheepishly was like, and I was like, and you're not gonna, I mean, I then just continued, but it was like, they're not gonna look it up later. And it was just like, it was so infuriating. And then when I shouldn't say this part. Then when they did hire a director. They finally created a center, which, yeah, does that now. But now I often have conversations with students who sort of want to do everything. And I'm like, let it be institutionalized. Like if student affairs wants to work on rainbow graduation, like that's what we were demanding 20 years ago. Like you shouldn't have to plan this every year. Like it should be someone's job, and you should go and talk to the person whose job it is and be a part of the ceremony. And it's interesting to me, like how right now, like, you know, oh God, it's not, I was about to say 20 years ago, but it's actually 30 years ago. So 30 years ago, we were, you know, making these demands for institutional support to kind of institutionalize the have people who are really experts, who really understand what we need and can help us. And now I often, you know, I kind of have to explain that back, where I'm like, no, like actually it's really good that they want to take that over. And you should focus your energies on what isn't there already. Like you want to focus your energies on kind of what we need to change, but yeah, but we need to institutionalize it. So I'm sorry, I feel like I got a little off track.
Well, you never picked a metaphor.
Oh, for me?
Yeah. let me say one thing while you think about it, Jason, which
Yeah.
is we need to end. We don't have to end because for a lot of reasons, including that apparently the hardest thing in the whole world is editing this down to an hour.
Okay.
But we don't have to end on the metaphor. I just want to say thank you so much to Kevin, Amanda, Jana, V, for coming in person virtually. And anybody who watches this later. And so much, so much, so much thank you to you, Jason. I mean, now maybe people can have a sense in live time why it was impossible to get this episode down more than we did, because everything out of your mouth is totally fascinating to me. I have already like pages of notes just from what you said. I want to ask a million. Yeah, I mean, you're just an amazing teacher. You're an amazing thinker, and also like so available. Thank you for not making me feel stupid for asking questions when I don't know the answers to things and explaining things to me. Um, and yeah, do you want to pick a metaphor, or you don't have to, of
Well, I
course.
sort of never needed one. I mean, and I'm like, when I said like I never understood why those demands for history sort of made things better. In part, it's because I had those histories.
Hmm.
I fit perfectly into like white gay men are hyper represented.
I
Um,
get,
you know,
I get what you're saying about this, Jason. Um, that you fit, that in good ways and bad, and like that you fulfilled a lot of these stereotypes. I guess maybe my question is not clear enough, because
mhm,
you're, on the one hand, you are not a confessional poet.
right.
On the other hand, you are certainly part of the confessional legacy, and you employ, in terms of your subject matter, there's a really, and in terms of your subject position and your identity, it's this idea of confessionality, or of coming out of the closet, or of being revealing, certainly describes the kind of poetry world that you inhabit. And yet, your preference for a certain kind of obliqueness, and for a certain kind of privacy, and for poetry as a place, unlike in Sharon Olds' work, where the feelings, that where the autobiographicality is much less important than the truth that's revealed by a certain kind of language, which may occlude the story or hide the speaker or other people in the poems. There, you don't fit into the mold of confessional poets. And I think I would say, but I'm not on super solid ground, that the metaphor of the closet, in terms of your poetry, also falls short to some extent. Not
You
necessarily you, but your poems, maybe.
the thing about a metaphor is that it always makes too much meaning, right? That a metaphor that you're sort of like trying to make one thing visible by talking about another thing, but then they kind of get together, and in that moment you sort of have it's no longer just kind of this piece or that piece, and it's kind of like this gestalt where you kind of have like a little more meaning, and I'm both in love with that and suspicious of it.
Mm.
And the other thing I didn't say was that I didn't trust prose. And it took me a very long time to learn to write essays. I mean, I actually, in part, I got the PhD because I had to force myself to write prose because I was so afraid of it and I couldn't deal with it. And part of the reason I couldn't deal with it was that every sentence, and this will sound a little extreme, but every sentence in prose has always struck me as a lie.
Mhm.
That there's something left out. That there's this way in which, and I think we sort of talked about this with like the think feel, right? That
Mhm.
that if we have to kind of like split the thinking and the feeling, there's a way in which the sort of intellectual expectations of prose made me feel like something was missing. And the fact of white space, which paradoxically calls attention to the fact that there's like a space, there's something not set, there's something that goes to the spine or to the leaf, felt honest. That actually the act of saying that the way in which poems are, and now I can put this in the context of like, you know, romanticism and the way in which romanticism celebrates the fragment so that it can be contradictory and resistance to enlightenment rationalism. But just as a young person, I felt like a liar all the time, except when I was writing poems. And something about the way in which the poem allowed me to calibrate the emotional landscape of the information that I was delivering. It was the only place, like that was where I felt like myself. That was
Okay,
where
is this a nutso thing to say? That the question or the answer, in a sense, to the question of is the closet an accurate metaphor for you is the question is not am I in the closet or out of the closet. I'm a poet, and being a poet is especially the way that you are a poet is doesn't no, I'm not saying being a poet is a metaphor, but it's a process or an identity or an experience that is never going to be either in or out of the closet if one is really writing with multiplicity of meaning, with um, with directness, but not just a dump, just like a sense like, well, you will be interested in this because I told you the truth. Um, uh, is that nuts?
no, I think what you're saying is that um, in talking about that metaphor, right? That like, okay, so not telling people that you're gay is like being inside of a closet, and telling people that you are gay is like being outside of a closet, and we'll just put that together: closet, gay. But it explodes, right? Like it sounds like it's a very simple thing that promises one moment of exit, but
And
instead,
that's prose. Those are the kinds
right.
of closed statements that prose or the sentence is aimed at.
Right. And exactly. And so that sense of process, that sense of excess, that sense of like it's not, it feels like it promises once, but the truth is endless. The truth
Mm.
is a kind of ongoingness. The truth is a kind of endless negotiation. And if you think about how like with, and if you use the metaphor of the closet to kind of think about how metaphor sort of like just keeps making too much meaning, right? That if you look at something like Paul Manette's, and I don't think people read it anymore, Paul Manette's Half a Life Story, Becoming a Man, Half a Life Story, which is all about, you know, like has this like 5-page introduction that's just about escaping the closet. And the closet really becomes a coffin in that introduction. You know, Eve Sedgwick's epistemology of the closet, like the notion of glass closets, you know, when Ellen DeGeneres was coming out of the closet and we all knew, and, you know, she was on like television saying like, I have to tell you I'm Lebanese, right? That do you remember that? Like it really happened. That there's this way in which in prose, there's the promise that things will be contained, but in actual fact, they keep exploding in these ways that I could never track down and always made me feel like a liar. Whereas in poetry, it looks like it's very contained, but the agreement with the reader is that it's expansive. And so that
Mm.
made me feel like I could sort of do something there that might last, that might move someone, that might actually kind of find a readership.
Okay, well, maybe we should end on that beautiful note. So thank you all again. And
And
Jason,
thank you. This has been so wonderful. And V, thank you. And Jana and Amanda and Kevin, thank you for being here. But Rachel, this has been really wonderful. I mean, as you saw, I think probably more in the talkback than in the podcast. Like I'm very reticent about the autobiographical, and it was sort of wonderful. Like you made a space where I felt really comfortable being kind of open and vulnerable in a way that I don't. I don't usually feel comfortable, and I felt really comfortable, and so thank you.
oh, I thank you for going there with me. Yeah. Okay, goodbye. Everybody take care.